I'm Chap Bettis, and you're listening to The Disciple-Making Parent, where we seek to equip parents and churches to pass the gospel to their children.
Has someone you know deconstructed? What exactly does that mean? And just as important, what can we do about it? Hi, my name is Chap Bettis, and I'm the author of The Disciple-Making Parent. And numerous so-called Christians are walking away from the faith. In the process, they're using the term deconstructing. I have a friend my age who recently walked away from the faith, and it's heartbreaking and shocking at the same time. What is happening? That's what I feel like I want to ask the Lord. Well, it was with this in mind that I listened to the breakout session that Collin Hansen taught at the Gospel Coalition Women's Conference in 2024. And in that time, he used a phrase, disenculturation. And I found that fascinating. In addition, he goes on to talk about questions that he asks his students, that if you viewed your church experience as the eyes of a missionary, what are positive essentials that you would take to a new culture? What are neutral things that you could bring or not bring? And what are negative things in your current culture that you would not bring to a new culture? Well, that exercise helps students evaluate their culture and also go back to the Bible to see it more clearly. Well, I found this description helpful, disenculturation, because that's exactly the process that I went through as a young person growing up. I didn't leave the faith, but I did examine it and I hope grew more biblical. Well, I wanted to pass on this idea to pastors and parents of both teens and young adults. Collin Hansen serves as the Vice President for Content, and he's Editor-in-Chief for the Gospel Coalition. He's best known for his writing on the New Calvinism, and he hosts Gospel Bound podcast. And I've interviewed him before on his book and numerous books that he's written, but I've interviewed him with the book Rediscover Church, Why the Body of Christ is Essential. And he and his wife live in Birmingham, Alabama, which is close to my heart, and they have 3 children. Well, before we start, though, I want to remind you of 2 resources that may be of interest to you. First, our newest book is entitled Launch, Biblical Help to Move Your Teen or Young Adult into the Real World. It's a short read, 1 hour, and it's information I wish I had when I was raising teenagers. And so you can find it on our website or on Amazon. The book is Launch, Biblical Help for Moving Your Teen or Young Adult into the Real World. And of course, the second resource that we always highlight is that we give away the audiobook of The Disciple-Making Parent absolutely free. Just visit our website, thedisciplemakingparent.com, for our weekly newsletter, and we'll give you the whole audiobook for free. We're on a mission to equip parents, grandparents, and pastors to pass the gospel to their children. So head on over to thedisciplemakingparent.com for your free audiobook. But for now, let's listen as Collin Hansen and I talk about disenculturation. It's a delight to have Collin Hansen on the Disciple-Making Parent podcast. So Collin, thanks for taking the time.
Oh, thanks, Chap. Glad to be here.
Well, I invited you because I was really impressed with the conference you did at TGC Women's, and it was on doubt and deconstructing. And you had a unique take, I thought, on that. And I think I'm thinking of parents who've watched their kids walk away from their faith. I've actually got a friend my age that's walked away from the faith. And so what is deconstruction? Where did this term come from, and why does it seem so prevalent right now?
Well, the term is borrowed from Derrida, and it's related to postmodernism philosophy. It, of course, embodies what a lot of us know from that period as the tearing down. So, I mean, that's really what it means when it comes to the faith. We're tearing down what we had learned from our parents, what we'd learned from the church, what we'd learned from other authority figures. So now there is a lot of debate, Chap, about exactly what this term means. That's what it means, technically speaking, but sometimes people mean it to have a positive connotation, meaning you're tearing down to be able to rebuild. So I don't recommend people use that terminology there, because you're going to be talking to somebody over here who is really using it as a synonym for apostasy. So it can, I think more technically speaking, it's more of I'm leaving the faith, and it could be a slow process, it could be a sudden process, but it often comes with a significant amount of accusation and frustration and antagonism toward the previous authority figures there. So I think that there's better ways for us to talk about what is a necessary process of learning to work through our faith in different cultures. But I wouldn't recommend deconstruction, but generally that's what people mean with it, the tearing down what they've inherited.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting as I've thought of people and watched people, is I feel like it's exactly that. It's not even replacing it with anything. It's just tearing down, and sometimes ex-evangelicals can be among some of the most evangelistic in terms of how we're believing the wrong things now, and how they've come to see the light. But apostasy itself is an old term. I mean, you've got Hebrews, which is written to Christians to say, don't turn back.
Right.
Well, talk a little bit about the term you like better. I know you've used it in the class you teach, so just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so disenculturation here is an alternative, and I first came across this term in a book that we actually released at the Gospel Coalition called Before You Lose Your Faith, and a pastor out there in Colorado, Hunter Beaumont, had commended this process of disenculturation instead of deconstruction. Turns out he had borrowed it from Richard Lovelace, who now we're coming full circle here because he was a mentor to Tim Keller. And so the process of disenculturation, and this is what I do in my class with students, is I encourage them to re-narrate their story as a Christian who's somebody called to ministry, but to do it as if they were an outsider to their story. So we're all familiar as evangelicals with the testimony, but usually you're publicizing your internal process. The process of disenculturation is learning to see yourself from somebody else's perspective. And so I asked them to go back and really think about being a missionary trying to propagate your faith in a foreign, different culture. Well, you'd have to take a kind of look at your faith in three ways. Number one, you'd have to say, what is it about the faith that I inherited from my host home culture that I'm going to hold on to with everything? I don't care where I am. I don't care who I'm talking to. I'm not giving this up. Go to the other end of the spectrum. What's something that I was taught in my home culture as a Christian or from Christians or other significant authority figures that I know when I look at the Bible, when I look at history, when I look at other cultures, this is wrong. They told me that it was essential to be a Christian, but in fact, they're wrong. And I would be totally wrong if I did the same thing with others. And the third step is, what are those things that are neutral? They may be characteristics of your home culture, and maybe it would be fine to be able to bring those into another culture as long as you didn't mandate them as requirements, but they could simply be options there. But you don't want to confuse them for being absolutes. I think, Chap, what this process does, and this for parents or for anybody else, is it helps parents to see that your children, especially as they become adults, maybe they move to a different part of the country, they marry a spouse with some different perspectives and different history on things, you're recognizing that they're going to go through a necessary process of leaving behind some of the things that you thought were important, but not necessarily leaving the faith. And then they may also be tempted to toss things out that were essential to the faith. You know, that you don't want them to do that, but that's kind of what they have to sort through. And then this is, of course, Chap, where it can become difficult. They may end up rejecting things that you thought were necessary or at least very beneficial to the faith. They may actually conclude were wrong. They were actually really bad as a Christian. Now, of course, none of us as a Christian wants to think that way about the faith. But when you look back through history, the number of examples are just nearly infinite of things that Christians thought were essential to being a Christian, but really were actually sinful manifestations of culture. Of course, Chap, you and I both have deep roots in Alabama, and racism would be one of those topics that's not unique to Alabama, but is one of those things that Christians have had to work through.
Well, I want to get to thinking about racism there, but before we do that, just there's this idea so cult is belief, culture is externalization of that belief, and there's all different ways, and I think actually we could argue that one of the beauties of Christianity is that it is enculturated, that you go to a church in Africa and it's different than a church in the United States, and it doesn't look like some other religions would look very much the same. And so that's one of the beauties, but I think what you're talking about here is there's all these aspects, and it doesn't even have to be as serious as racism. So we were to not show a lot of movies to our kids when they were growing up. So now they're young adults, and some of their friends are making references to TV shows that they watched, and they're like, well, I have no idea what that is. And then of course there's the VeggieTales culture. So there's all different cultures. There's all different externalization of beliefs that I think as a person growing up has to process that and say, was that good? Was that bad?
Or just something about a certain place and time. I mean, I'll give you, Chap, an example here that was somewhat significant for me growing up. Around the 1970s, and we could go in more detail with that if you'd like, but contemporary music began to become more of a fixture within churches. And now it's to the point where it's pretty normal. We're post-worship wars with all that sort of stuff. And not everybody uses contemporary music, but it's just pretty accepted. But my grandmother, who died a couple years ago, she'd been a lifelong United Methodist, and she simply could not bring herself to understand how you could have a guitar in church. Now, she was fine. Go off to your youth camps and have all the guitars that you want, but it's not church if there's a guitar in there. Now, I understand from her culture and her time why she felt that way. There's nothing wrong with her saying, I prefer an organ and an hymnal. The difficulty, though, of course, is that the hymnal itself was an innovation. Hymns were themselves something that emerged, especially in the revivals of the 18th century. Revivals that, incidentally, her husband's family, my grandfather, were involved with as Calvinistic Methodists back in Wales in the 18th century there. So it's a really cool story in there, but I think we can all intuitively understand that what is traditional and feels essential to the faith for one generation could be very different in terms of those cultural manifestations. Another example here, Chap, would be dress. There really is not anything in the Bible that's going to tell us this is how you need to be able to dress. And yet, as having been a pastor for so many years, that's a really emotional concept for people in there. And so as parents, we're just sort of thinking through these things, just watching my grandmother talk with my mother about these things well into their adulthood. I think we can afford to have grace to people who are older, who have experienced their enculturation of kind of a match of this is what Christianity and church means to me, but without allowing them to dogmatically dictate for everybody else that this is how church has to be, i.e., I can't worship if there's a guitar. The Bible just doesn't really allow you to say that. That's going beyond Scripture.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. And again, I mean, this gets into my story, having grown up in the South and in a church that various degrees of health, but a choir and robes and other things that went along with that as a teenager I'm wrestling with or not loving. And so I think, but one of the things really in college, I think, was I tried to go further into the Bible and say, where is that? and if it's not there, what's the reasoning? And so I don't know. I know I'm a little further ahead than you are with your kids,
Yeah.
but I've tried to do that with my kids, as my adult children as well, to say, I know I have blind spots, but show them to me from the Bible. Help me be a better Christian. Not, I don't want to endure in my blind spots, but just because it's new doesn't mean it's better. I guess that would be.
Yeah. Well, I think there are a number of things that we can do, and that's a good one for parents to engage with older children, that the Bible's the ultimate test. And just like I said right there, if we in our culture are going beyond a scripture, we need to at least put it into that neutral category. Maybe it's in the bad category, but we need to at least dial it back into that neutral category. But of course, with our children, we can likewise encourage them to say, well, it norms you as well. So you can't go beyond to say, and this of course happens the other direction. It's very much the case that younger people would be tempted to see that if there is formality, like you were saying right there, that can't be Christianity. That was actually Tim Keller's view. It's one of the reasons that he was very negative after his conversion toward the church, because he had a bad experience in church growing up. He had a good experience with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and a contemporary type culture. And it had to be Ed Clowney to come in and say, no, the church is valuable, because he saw it as this, this enculturated institution that was there was no life in there. So it can work in both directions there. What I do with our kids, because they're younger, is it's just travel. If you're going to churches in different environments, yes, there are going to be some things that are common in other places. That's what we like to highlight. There's going to be things that are very different. And so it's a helpful way, especially if you get a chance to. Not everybody does, of course, but if you get a chance, travel internationally. But then again, there are plenty of churches in your own vicinity, wherever you live in the United States, where you're going to quickly jump that cultural barrier. So visiting other churches can be a really easy way to help people to see what's essential about the faith and to recognize, as they discern when they get older, of how to find what is it that I need to preserve and what is it I can afford to flex on.
What are some answers that you've gotten from your kids? So again, the question was, what in our culture do we have to keep?
Oh, that's interesting.
What in our culture do I actually need to reject? And then what is neutral? So some interesting ones that surprise
I don't think my kids are old enough to have a lot of observations about that yet. I mean, we were able to visit a number of different churches in the UK, and I think the positive there was the levels of continuity that they saw. So it's not just the negative examples, but it's often the positive examples of, oh, okay, so they preach the same word, they sing the same gospel, same gospel, maybe different songs. The children's ministries that they experience are different. My favorite one was in Cambridge, and I think my daughter was something like, she was 5 or something like that at the time. She came back having to write down the name of a friend of hers that she was going to evangelize. So she just ended up picking a kid from preschool who got in trouble all the time, which was pretty funny. But I think that's the positive has been really the continuities to see a church as a church wherever you go. But do you have a couple examples, Chap, of ways your kids ended up maybe convicting you about some things, even as a pastor?
Well, I think just I think just this issue of race being more sensitive. So I did go well educated, and there was a big emphasis on that in school, but not the emphasis that there is today. And so being more aware of that, and that's been helpful. And I think, honestly, I'll say this on tape, but a question that haunts me growing up in the South and being a pastor now in New England is would I have supported segregation as a pastor? And that's where I'm like, I want to be so biblical that I would have been willing to change my culture. And I think that's hopefully the commitment of parents, but I think also for kids too, and being able to look and laugh at some things like whether it's VeggieTale culture or purity culture, and say, yeah, there were some things, but now Now, as adults, young adults, you're going to be middle-aged adults. You're going to be creating your own culture, and you're going to make some mistakes too. So, talk a little bit about the Jesus revolution, because I thought that example was really helpful in sort of in real time what you're talking about, where Christians had to decide.
Well, some may be familiar with that movie Jesus Revolution, the Erwin brothers, and just a retelling of that Jesus movement revival. I wrote a book in 2010 on revival, and the one that people asked me about the most was that revival from the 60s and 70s, especially among youth. And I didn't feel like we had enough distance to be able to assess it. If I were updating the book today, I would definitely add it. There's been more recognition, and sometimes that happens when some of the key figures are nearing the end of their life. Like Tim Keller was exactly dead in the middle. He was right in the middle of that whole revival. And as we look back on it now at the end of his life, died in 2023, we can see some of all those effects of what happened. So, but one of the basic questions that came there is we didn't have a lot of the things that we now take for granted in the church. Take something as simple, chap, as extemporaneous prayers. Now, here's a good example of something that goes through a disenculturation process, but then a kind of a reinculturation process, because now you have a lot of people who think that if a prayer is scripted or, say, liturgical, it can't be genuine. Well, back then, there was no expectation of extemporaneous prayers. There was not this, I'm just going to start talking to the Lord and I'm not going to use casual language, because that's not appropriate for talking to God. I'm not going to call him Daddy God or something like that, because he's a little bit more distant there. Well, through extemporaneous prayer, we recognize that, well, actually there is an intimacy there. And in some ways, that's more similar to David's prayers in the Psalms there. So hopefully where we end up with that is seeing how the benefits of extemporaneous prayers, with also retaining a lot of the benefits of the liturgical, that they don't need to be pitted against each other. But that's one example of how your culture will dictate what you think is genuine worship. A second I've alluded to earlier would be dress. Do you have to dress a certain way to be able to be a reverent Christian? So once again, the question is reverence on the one side, accessibility on the other side. No coincidence here. I think it coincides then with a significant de-Christianization of America that's happening then, because people are wondering, well, fewer people connected to church, they don't know these traditions, so we need to try to meet them in their own terms to be able to bring them in. Same thing then with music. My grandmother saying, well, this just really isn't proper worship if it's a guitar. That's an informal instrument. Yeah, the Bible itself, you have the lyre in there. So I don't see how you can really complain about that. There's obviously no organs in the Bible. So you see that shift as well. But a lot of the things that we know now, actually, it's like I've been alluding to a couple other times here, chap, it's almost reversed. And now I see some people say, especially with church planting, that if it's not informal, then again, it must be wrong. It's not going to be okay for people. But then again, I live in an environment where a number of people, especially African Americans, are less likely to visit a church that's informal. They're looking for a more dressed up environment. So once again, it's just different cultural nuances. The challenge is, and for parents especially, is to not universalize your practices as norms that are required if it's not in Scripture. That is just one of the easiest things to do to discourage your children in their faith when you make, neutral things requirements. Of course, we can go further and talk about the negative things. That's even more challenging. Yeah. But Jesus' revolution was mostly just those neutral things, because they were.
Church members have to decide, are these hippies coming to Christ going to have to give up drugs and free sex?
And free sex, exactly. It's kind of an Acts 15 moment there, because it's like, okay, well, you don't have to follow these. That's a covenant issue. They're not equated with each other. But Acts 15, the question is, what do you need to do? Remember the poor and flee sexual immorality. But you don't have to practice these dietary laws. Similar dynamic playing out. You got to give up the drugs. You got to give up the sex outside of marriage, but you're not going to have to put on shoes.
And I think I remember reading at one point one story where a hippie who didn't know any better, like just came down and sat, on the floor in front of the preacher, and then an older man got up, and everybody's like, "Oh my gosh, what's he going to do?" And then he ended up sitting next to the guy.
Yeah.
So just like, okay. I have a friend. He's gone to be with the Lord. He was an elder, seriously, in his 90s. And his saying was, I don't have to like everything, but I like to see God at work. And I've tried to stick with that. But so some of the things, I wonder if this is as Christians, we should expect slander. We should expect twisting, as Acts 14 talks about some coming to poison their minds. But having said that, Christians have been guilty of doing wrong things, so-called Christians, and then true Christians. So just talk a little bit about how you walk your class through just this idea, this accusation. Oh, the Bible promotes racism, promotes slavery, and you need to throw out the whole thing because of that.
Yeah, once again, this is really connected so much to people's perceptions of culture. And so we walk through CHAP, and I won't go through the whole thing here, of course, but one of the things that I observe, and this will just be a quick example of it, technology will often shape our perceptions of reality, and they will often also change what we find to be acceptable in the church. So one of the examples I give is that if you go to the year 1800, you will not find Christians arguing that slavery is the cornerstone of Christian civilization. Won't find that. It's not there. Okay, so how do you get many of the most eminent theologians who were evangelicals in 1860 making statements like that? How does that happen? Well, one of the ways that it happens is that the cotton gin starts to become used all over the place, and all of a sudden, cotton becomes more profitable than tobacco had been, and slavery expands dramatically. And so part of recognizing that we are people who are embedded for better or worse in a culture is one of the most important things to realize. And then, for example, you see all these theologians arguing, well, the Bible supports slavery. Well, the Bible's view on slavery is quite complicated. Many people have talked about this, but the one thing we can know for sure is that the Bible did not conceive of slavery as being a race-based institution or as being for all time, which were two of the key cornerstones, of course, of the Southern, American slavery, and which endured for longer across the South and was endorsed and supported by many Christians in there. So those are just a couple examples of how needing that cultural perspective is important. And then a final one, Chap, actually goes back to something you said earlier, and I connect it once again to a biblical hermeneutic. Let's take the example of David and Saul and the Philistines, and with Goliath. Many great preachers and commentators have helped us to see that it's not really our place to be in the position of David in that moment, because we're not likely to be David. We're likely to have been all his brothers and Saul and everybody else who are just freaking out about this and don't have the courage. And so Jesus goes forward as our David. When I look back on the historical situations that are most intense, I think about right here in Birmingham, Alabama, 1963. I think about, not that they're equated in all the same ways, but Nazi Germany, 1935. Think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Confessing Church, and whatnot. And I preach on these topics and teach on them regularly. I'm not honest with myself if I assume that I would have been Bonhoeffer, or that I would have been, the pastor of First Baptist Birmingham, Earl Stallings. That's not realistic. There were 3 Southern Baptist pastors out of 1,000. 3 out of 1,000 who spoke up in defense, or Earl Stallings and then two of his friends who spoke up in his defense for integrating his church with Andrew Young in 1963 in Birmingham. It's just not realistic. I just preached a sermon, Chap, on Jeremiah and Zedekiah. And I was thinking, we love to identify with Jeremiah, but I got to say, Zedekiah is a lot more realistic. A guy who puts his finger to the political winds and says, I'm not the worst, but I'm not the best. I'm going to try to hedge my bets and see what works. Oh, this is why we need Christ, because we need the courage to do the right thing. That's ultimately what we're looking for. And we need grace for when we fall far short. And yes, mostly in history, people fall far short, which is why people like Bonhoeffer and Stallings stand out for us. But the power of culture to dictate right and wrong and to go along with that as Christians, including together in churches, is really, really strong. And I can't imagine, Chap, one of the dynamics that is so significant in all those situations is that being a parent is a really strong incentive toward not doing something bold. Because I think about even just physically where I sit right now. I think about one of my neighbors, if we go back to 1963, who spoke out against segregation. He wasn't allowed to stay. His family couldn't stay. They had to leave the city. And so you just wonder, as a parent, am I willing to do the right thing as a Christian when I know that my family, my kids, are going to pay that price, whether they choose to or not there? It's a good, necessary thing, but harder than we maybe want to admit that it is.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking as a parent, it seems like we almost want to hold two things, and pastors, you want to hold two things in tension. On the one hand, I want to have confidence in the scripture. I want to have confidence that 90%, like I can go forward. I don't want anyone listening to this, and I'm sure you don't either, to be to draw the conclusion, it's all cultural, I can't do anything.
Right.
No, there's confidence in the gospel, the word of God,
Amen.
how it applies, principles that apply to parenting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one hand. But on the other hand, there's also humility and sensitivity maybe to say, I have not arrived. I still see through a glass darkly, and I want to keep growing. And so it's how to hold those in tension, and raise kids who are confident in the Lord, and yet say, hey, you're going to keep growing. So maybe that leads into my last. Did you have a comment on that?
Well, I was just thinking this works both ways, because when our children are in our home, we're not eager to put them in harm's way for a difficult decision, even as Christians. We may have to do that, and it's a good thing when we do, but it's not easy to do. But of course, as parents, the reverse happens when our kids decide to when they're older, take a bold, costly decision that we may not want to have to bear the burdens of. I mean, we could be thinking about something as simple as being a missionary overseas, and how thinking, well, I'd rather have my kids be home near me, or I'd rather have my grandkids around. These are real sacrifices, and sometimes we're tempted to think, I wish my child was a little less obedient. Like you said, it's a tension in there, because it's the flesh, the world, the devil that tempts us there to do it, but it's also hard. We pay the price for those things. So I just want to bring it to the human level to acknowledge the tensions that come out in these things. I think when we acknowledge them up front, it makes it easier to choose what we must do in that moment.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, if we're willing to say, following the Lord is taking up the cross, and and that can be both some suffering if our kids are very obedient. That can be suffering if they're not obedient.
Well, both ways, yeah.
Embarrass us. Let me just to end here. Any way for pastors to sort of proactively teach that difference between non-negotiables and enculturation, just sort of set the table for everybody else?
Well,
how to do that?
yeah, I think there are some ways to do it. One of the ways as a preacher, this gets a little bit harder when your church is smaller, gets a little bit harder when your church is new, but it would be one reason not to have a pastor dominate the pulpit, to let other people within the church, other staff or elders, to be able to preach. It's another reason to bring in a pastor who you share a common faith with from the outside, or even somebody else from your own community. That makes it even easier sometimes, but it can also be the case with missionaries that you support or bringing them back. The point is that you're simply not wanting to. We all know as preachers and pastors that we bring a lot of our personality into that pulpit. It's unavoidable. So one of the ways we can mitigate the melding of our personalities and our culture with Christianity is to be able to help people to see the gospel and God's word expressed by other people with some other different strengths and weaknesses in there. Generally, I think maybe helping people to bridge the gap. I alluded to this earlier. This is a huge change from decades ago. You just don't have to go overseas to have radically different cultures or foreign cultures or different languages in your midst. And so that gives you so much more of an option to say, let's look for those churches around us that share the common faith. Maybe they do some things that we wouldn't do that way, but they're not propagating anything that we would reject. So you're not doing a prosperity gospel church, something like that in there where they're denying the gospel, but you're looking for those common partners of just trying to build those relationships, those friendships, those collaborations with them. Of course, we try to do this through the Gospel Coalition's regional chapters, things like that can facilitate that. I think those small ways can help a congregation just be able to see. I think it's generally the case that most churches are going to understand positively, this is what we're all about, this is what we believe, maybe even negatively. But I think the biggest danger for most churches is actually the cultural accretions, the things that just build up over time. And one final thing I'll commend here, I don't have time to get into it with great detail, but this is why I think the process of theological vision articulated by one of New England's finest in Richard Lentz, a longtime Gordon Conwell professor, his concept of theological vision is so powerful because I find, Chap, that a lot of churches have their statement of faith kind of in mothballs. It's not really functional for guiding things in the church beyond kind of maybe an elder affirmation or something like that. Then they have programs, and those programs are really what people attach to, kind of the externalities. But people have a hard time being able to connect the two, what we do with what we believe. And sort of theological vision is helping people see why, and that process can help them to evaluate changes that need to make in their church, but also how they can relate in positive ways to other churches. So it's another thing that I commend in my classes, but people can study that from Rick Lentz, The Fabric of Theology, or you can pick it up from Tim Keller's Center Church. He has extensive engagements there. It's also in the Gospel Coalition's Foundation documents because it's the basis by which we can collaborate across Presbyterian lines and Anglican lines, Baptist, non-denominational, but also different ethnicities, different parts of the country. That's how we're able to share one gospel, but not, define it according to one specific form.
That's good. That's helpful. Well, I really appreciate this conversation and just this idea of disenculturation, because I've got a good friend, and he has followed the criticism to the point where he has no faith anymore. So I know I went through certainly a time of saying, what is a healthy church? What does the Bible have the answers? Lo and behold, it does. And the church form that I ended up with in New England looks very different than the form that I grew up in. But the Bible does have the answers, and it can withstand kids going back and asking those questions. I loved your book, Before You Lose Your Faith.
Lose Faith, yeah.
The title.
Before You Lose Your Faith.
Keith Plummer. I really liked his chapter there on science versus
Deconstructing Doubt in the Church is what that one. So that would be definitely where I'd encourage people to go. Ian Harbour is an author who I'll be interviewing soon on Gospel Bound, but he has a new book on deconstruction. He wrote about his process of leaving the faith and coming back and what he learned. So for parents, both of those are resources that are designed to be able to help with the overall phenomenon of deconstruction.
And then, of course, you'd recommend anything by Rebecca McLaughlin.
Rebecca McLaughlin, well, especially just because, well, I'll just say this, chap. One thing, Rebecca, like Tim Keller, like a number of other apologists, are really good at dealing with the topics that come up. But what you want to understand as a parent is that what your children are expressing may actually be a rational explanation for what is actually happening elsewhere in their lives. So it can often be a mask. So as a parent, the real task is to engage in a non-defensive, non-anxious way with the rational explanation and try to continue to pursue the heart and find out what's happening underneath. Tim Keller got into trouble for saying this once, and it's an exaggeration, but somebody asked him an apologetic question, like, what do you say to somebody who has a problem with this issue with the Christian faith? And he said, ask them who they're sleeping with. You know from pastoral ministry and parenthood and everything else that that's often the case, not just sleeping, but there's something else. When people have questions about the faith, it's often because they have an aspiration to join a different group, a different tribe, a different identity. And that's what we want to kind of get after there. And that's why a church community and a family that are not defensive about challenges to the faith, but are willing to engage them, is one of the most healthy things that you can do positively to help your kids not feel like I've got to run away and it's all going to collapse when I'm challenged on it. So maybe that's a different podcast, but I wanted to toss that in here in the end.
And with that, we'll drop the mic because that shows wisdom beyond your years. That's absolutely true. Yes, there's the mental aspect. Don't be defensive, but get to the heart. What are they aspiring to? So, Collin, thank you. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for taking the time. Appreciate your friendship and praying God's blessings on you and your family.
Thanks, chap.
You've been listening to the Disciple Making Parent podcast. For more information about the book, The Disciple Making Parent, visit thedisciplemakingparent.com.